On the day of your birth, if I had taken you and placed you in Shanghai, China, right now, your first language would be Chinese, would be Mandarin. And you would know that language. How would that have changed everything about the way you see the world? We want to appreciate the connections between language and the way we interpret the world. Well, we're going to now pay attention to some of the observations. First of all, on page 115, multiple languages. One of the most interesting is, for your notes, non-verbal language. Let's write that one down. Non-verbal language. Of all the languages that you've learned in your life, non-verbal language is fascinating as well. Notice, for example, she can tell when her mother is upset, not by what her mother says, but by her body language. And it allows, this nonverbal language, allows her to kind of interpret at times what's going on with the English language. On page 116, she begins to tell us about her odyssey into the English language. For example, she'll take a word like butter, and she's kind of fascinated by the sound of the word butter. And she'll say it over and over and over again. It becomes kind of like a mantra for her. And again, later, the word because comes to mind. Spanglish is the term that's used when you begin to breed a hybrid language, when you begin to bring together two languages. Any child that's grown up in a bilingual house knows about this kind of thing, where you're speaking one, then you're speaking another, and then you start to combine the two together. And sometimes people on the outside don't have a clue what you're talking about. By the way, earlier, we had another example of this in another text when we were working with Singer's text, Washwoman, and we were talking about the language Yiddish, which is a joining together of two languages as well, right? Notice on page 117, Alvarez tells us that when she's in class and she's being corrected, she feels, she says it in the first paragraph on 117, I would bow my head humiliated by the smiles and snickers of the American children around me. I grew insecure about Spanish. My native tongue was not quite as good as English. Think about if I right now were to uproot you from your town and I were to move you to some small village in Russia, and I were to drop you down into that village and throw you into school. No one in the school speaks any English. And you walk into that school as a high school freshman. Now everybody is talking to you. They're making gestures at you. They're treating you like you're a complete fool idiot. You know you're a fool idiot because of the way they're talking to you, but they're talking to you totally in Russian. Dude, you do not have a single clue. So you do what really is now, you have to laugh about it, a stupid thing. You try and talk back to them in English. And of course, you're ready to jack somebody because they're pushing you out of the way. And you're like, dude, you come at me again. But you're talking in your language. And they're looking at you like, you're a complete fool. Why don't you learn a language so that you at least have some clue what's going on? Think about the ways in which that dynamic would take the most confident of students in the language that you know. And all of a sudden, you'd start to feel awfully stupid. Right or wrong? Think about that 3B observation. It would make you immediately begin to feel lesser. Right? And the way they looked at you, and the way that they alienated you, and the way that they ignored you, and the way that you knew they were talking about you at lunch as you sat all alone at a table. I've had a freshman or two that says, you know what, I was raised speaking Spanish, and then I came to school. That's exactly how I felt at lunch. People were marginalizing me, all because of the language. So I wanted to learn the language so I could have what? P-O-W-E-R. What message is that sending? The language you speak tells you what kind of person that you are. Well, of course, you would say about that in your Russian experience, as I was imagining it. You would say, well, that's just silly. It's not that Russian is a more powerful language than English. It's just the language they're speaking, and it's the language I can't speak. In other words, language is understood as power by those who don't have the language. See the point we're making? This is a cultural phenomenon. There is no single language more important than another language on this planet. Many have argued that the English language is increasingly becoming the language on the planet, and there's no question that lots and lots of non-English speakers are wanting to learn English, and the primary reason they want to learn it, of course, the reason they want to be educated in it, is because, of course, P-O-W-E-R. Usually it's about economic power, right? So for example, you need to learn the language so that you can negotiate business and the like as you get older or whatever, right? Notice the notion of putting someone in their place by speaking English. I'm on page 117. Now, there is this term. I want it in your notes because I want you to be aware of it. Idiomatic expressions. It sounds like you're calling somebody an idiot. By the way, I'm with you on page 117. Do you see the word ponderously? It's right after that word in blue, your vocabulary word. Idiomatic expression. What is an idiomatic expression? It is a special use of the language. Write that down. It's a special use of the language. I remember many years ago, I was teaching ESL, English as a Second Language, at university. And a student came to me and he said, I don't understand. Over the weekend, they took me to a swimming pool and there was a large high dive. You went up 4 stairs to get there. And they took me to this and they told me, jump off. And my friends were jumping off. When I didn't jump off, they called me chicken and laughed. The student is asking me, can you explain to me why they call me chicken? I explained to the student, in languages you're learning, the idiomatic, the slang phrases, the special uses, some of the hardest to learn. But he said, I don't understand. Why they call me chicken? Because I don't jump into the water from very high. And I said, well, in our culture, we use the word chicken to talk about someone who is afraid. My student looked back at me and said, chickens? Afraid? In the culture where he came from, they put razor blades on the end of chickens. They dropped them down into a pen, and those chickens jacked on each other. Chickens, in his culture, are some of the fiercest of animals. He's like, why would you, in America, in English, call someone who is afraid a chicken? Because if you've spent any time around roosters, you know they are not afraid. They'll run right at you, as a matter of fact, which is fascinating. See the use of the language. Here we are with idiomatic expressions. And she makes that observation, right, that it's kind of hard sometimes to completely appreciate, right, the use of the language, and it takes time. We have a great word picture over on page 118. Let's go there now. A beginning wordsmith, I had so much left to learn. Sometimes it was disheartening. She tells of a family intellectual, right? The Teogas example here, who is sitting at the table. It's a powerful word picture. He takes 1 grain of salt and he puts it in the center of the table and he says, the table is all of your ability, your intellect. The grain of salt is how much you actually use of your mind. You got all of that mind. The little tiny grain of salt, that's all you use of your mind. Of course, this is an argument that's often been made to students. We don't use as much of our abilities as we actually could. I have had freshmen who admitted, I guess I probably could have done it a lot better in middle school. I could have learned a lot more. I could have known a lot more. I have seniors in the last week of their senior year who will admit to me, I probably could have used my talents a lot more, my mind a lot more than I did. The challenge here, of course, then is to use all of your mind. Notice, though, a grain of salt is that idiomatic phrase that will only have certain kinds of meanings if you understand the use of the term itself, right? Finally, she tells us about being at New York. She begins to relax into the language, she says on page 118 in that last paragraph, as she begins to understand. She notices that Americans are not necessarily smarter or a superior race. They just speak a language that, she says, I was only beginning to understand. And then on page 119, she uses the term acquired the language. Now, this is a distinction that's made by a number of academics, that there's a difference between learning a language and acquiring the language. You learn the language by learning a bit of its grammar rules and the like. You acquire the language when you can, for example, tell jokes in the language and get it. When you can dream in the language, that's the acquiring of the language. And it says, she says, it took her a long time to begin to acquire the language. The key, and this is huge for our notes, and we'll come back to it in a bit at levels 2 and 3, is a teacher, a great teacher. The teacher doesn't teach her just grammar. Notice what the teacher teaches her. The teacher teaches her the ways in which she can begin to love the language. Notice, for example, a great teacher changes her world. Supposing, that phrase, just supposing, and then begins to play the game. Notice, for example, you can take a single easy line, right, and you can turn that into something powerful, right? So, for example, she would ask questions that would lead to all kinds of beautiful stories. And ultimately, for Alvarez, she began to write poetry herself. Notice a great little touch on page 120. When the teacher is teaching Sister Maria, she pushes on the blackboard so hard that it breaks, right? It breaks the chalk because she has so much energy. It's a nice touch. It's one of those that kind of stay in our mind's eye as we go, right? Finally, we're told that Sister Maria filled the chalkboard with snowy print, on, handling, I'm reading from the last paragraph, handling and shaping and moving the language, scribbling all over the board until English, those verbal gadgets, those tricks and turns of phrases, those little fixed units and counters became a charged, fluid mass that carried me in its great fluent waves, rolling and moving onward to deposit me on the shores of my new homeland. That sentence alone, I mean, I'm not going to go into major detail. I'll let you study it on your own at 2B. That is a brilliantly crafted sentence. It's almost like reading poetry instead of prose for us. What a beautiful passage. All right, let's jump now to 2A really quickly. Let's say three things that maybe theme message-wise we want to say about this text. 1, learning. All forms of learning always are hard. Why? Because they always involve fear and pain. Go back to our introductory lectures on my son learning to ride his bike. The challenge, of course, is to overcome the fear, overcome the pain, and to go through the process of learning. Right? Number 2, language learning is different from language acquiring. When you acquire a language, you begin to live with that language, play with that language. Can we say it? Enjoy that language. And that's always a challenge. Can I say this out loud without insult? Some of us who are native speakers of English are still trying to learn to love the language. We struggle. We know how to use the language. Dude, we can read. We just don't enjoy reading. We can write. We just don't enjoy writing. We can't play with the language yet. And the challenge for us is to maybe grow as speakers and readers of the language to begin to kind of manipulate the language. Having said that, I've had students that tell me they hate the language, but they listen to rap music, for example, which does what? Plays with the language. Think what rap music is. It is playing with language. Yes? And the rhythms that are accompanied to that are, of course, compelling for us. Finally, the notion that language is a part of power. Back to our Russian example. Dropping into that culture, if you knew you were stuck there and there was no way out, you would be forced to have to learn first and then later acquire Russian. And the only way you would ever find any sense of source of identity and power would be in the learning of the language. That would be your key. At 2B, we've already mentioned this is an autobiographic piece. She obviously is playing powerful games with us. Let's also point out at 2B, this is a tribute text. Notice it is a tribute text. She is going to make a tribute comment to her teacher, Sister Maria, who, notice, Sister Maria helped her to love the language, and then Julia Alvarez goes on to write a text that ends up in an anthology that we're studying. There's something really cool about that, right? So she goes from not knowing the language at all to writing an essay about learning the language that ends up in a freshman anthology. There's something kind of really, really cool about that. One of the classic examples, by the way, for your notes about this, in your senior year, you'll study a guy named Joseph Conrad who grew up all his life in Poland. He spoke Russian and Polish and then learns English in his year 30. He doesn't learn English before that and becomes one of the greatest writers in the English language. That would be like me dropping you into Russia and at the age of 30 you learn the Russian language and then you start writing, and Russians would call what you write some of their greatest literature. That would be a feat almost beyond belief, and that's Joseph Conrad, the great writer of texts like Heart of Darkness and others that we'll take a look at. I think we do Lagoon in your senior year of study. Okay, at 3A, how do you relate this to other texts? What is for you a text that helps you to kind of think about learning a language or learning, culturally speaking, some new ideas? What's your favorite movie about somebody trying to understand new culture? Of course, we can relate this immediately to that diary from Lady Bird Johnson. They're both autobiographic, right? They both are sharing important pieces of information about who they are and what they're about. The process of learning, of course, is an odyssey in itself, coming to terms with language. And I just used Odyssey and it comes to my mind, so I'll share it. Remember the classic story of the Odyssey, and we'll share more about this later in our freshman experience, that when Odysseus is met by that huge one-eyed Cyclops, Polyphemus, and he asks him, "What's your name?" And Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is going to eat all of the men, saving Odysseus for last. Odysseus says, "Me, I'm nobody." And he goes, "You, then, I'm going to eat you last, nobody." And for the rest of that one, the game, of course, is that Odysseus has called himself nobody. So later when they blind him, and he's blinded with that sharp telephone pole sticking out of his eye because he got drunk, remember? And they get him drunk, and then they shove a telephone pole in his eye. When he screams to his brothers to come for help, right? He's in the cave with the door shut. "Oh, I'm blinded, I'm blinded." "Who blinded you?" "Nobody blinded me, nobody blinded me." And they're like, "Dude, you're drunk, go back to sleep." We see that as kind of a joke. That is to say, language and the acquiring of language is always some kind of funny, not so funny, tragic, sometimes not so tragic journey, we might say. Of course, this takes us now to the questions at 3B. A couple of questions here for you to think about. What is the moment you can remember learning language at all? Do you have a memory? Do you have a memory, like for example, of, okay, I'm going to use because when somebody... Do you have a memory of the first time you started to manipulate language? For some of you, it happened before you can even remember. So for example, I can do a game like this. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of a cow jumping over a moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs, and 2 little kittens in a pair of mittens. Some of you immediately are recognizing I'm quoting a story that you heard 1,000 times in your youth called Good Night, Moon. Or how about this one? I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam, I am. Or the sun did not shine. It was too wet to play, so we sat in that house all that cold, cold, wet day, quoting the opening lines of Cat in the Hat. Many of you were raised on Dr. Seuss in your very young years, and you learned language that way. I've had students that go back and start reading some of that stuff, and they're like, that is amazing poetry, the repetition of words. Of course, some of you will remember, as I start to talk about it, your first Disney show that played language as well. What was your first Disney show that you can remember? And think about the ways language was acquired through the watching of that show over and over again. Some of you, if you ask the people who raised you, will tell you, you had the entire movie memorized. Every word. You could drop down any point in a movie, and immediately, I have students that say, I know every single line of Lion King. Every word. I know it all. I watched it so many times growing up. There it is. In other words, can you remember how you acquired language? Finally, this question. What about learning a new language? Why not challenge yourself to try to learn a new language, to try and crawl inside that culture? I mean, we can't drop you down, unfortunately. We can't drop you down into a village in the middle of nowhere, Russia, so that you can learn Russian. And yet, it would be an interesting experience. It would be a, can we say this out loud, humbling experience? So the next time that you're with somebody who doesn't speak your language, English, have a bit of compassion. Have a bit of humility. If the roles were reversed, and you couldn't speak their language, and they were ridiculing you or treating you inferior because of language. That's all it's about, language. Imagine what that's like. And have a bit of compassion to try and relate to, as Julio Alvarez is trying to help us here, what it's like to be in a situation where you don't have the gift, the opportunity yet, of knowing the language. Well, I hope you've been challenged by this reading, and I hope you'll maybe learn another language. That'd be good for you. Thank you.